I'm Helen Armitage.
And I'm Chris Webb.
And you're listening to The Next Normal, the podcast that explores the impact that the COVID-19 pandemic has had and continues to have on different individuals, organisations and sectors spanning the world of business, education and careers.
On The New Normal, we heard from a range of individuals about how they were adapting to a challenging climate. And we're now taking this one step further as we look to the future and quiz another slate of fantastic guests about how they're planning for the unknown, what different sectors are doing to adapt, and whether any green shoots of optimism are starting to appear in the wake of the pandemic and subsequent lockdown.
Thank you for joining us as we explore what the next normal might look like for all of us on a local, national and global scale.
Good morning and welcome to The Next Normal. As always, I'm joined by my co-host Helen Armitage. Helen, how are you doing today?
I'm very well today, Chris, very well. Weather's looking a bit gloomy, but I'm on I'd say about a 9 out of 10. I think it's my first 9 out of 10 since we started this podcast. But yeah, going well at the moment. How about you?
Don't think I can give myself a 10 out of 10. That's a little bit ambitious, but good to hear that you're doing so well. That's great. I think I'm probably about an 8. You were so enthusiastic there. I don't want to steal your thunder, but about an 8 out of 10 today. So welcome to those who are kind of listening at home. The episode that we're going to be looking at today, again, another topical one. We're going to be looking at the banking and finance sector, and we're very lucky this week to actually have 2 guests with us. So we're joined first of all by Giles Cunningham, who's CEO of the Bank of London in the Middle East and a former, or I suppose, Sheffield Hallam alumni, never a former alumni. So Giles, very good morning to you. How are you doing?
Hi, morning Chris, morning Helen. Really well, thank you.
Fantastic.
Maybe not a 10 or a 9, but not bad.
Okay. Yeah, we've set a high bar there. We've set a high bar. Let's see how our other guests maybe kind of contends with that. So we're also very pleased today to be joined by Zenith Shah. So Zenith is actually the president of FABSoc, so the Finance, Accounting and Banking Society at Sheffield Hallam University. So Zenith, very good to have you here with us. How are you doing today?
Hi Chris, hi Helen, hi Giles. I'm doing great. I'm really excited about this podcast as well. And I would say I'll match Helen on the feeling great today. I'm feeling on a 10 as well.
Brilliant.
Wow, a lot of positivity in this Zoom right now. Let's see if we can kind of keep this going throughout the podcast. So, and to kind of, I guess, continue in that theme, and before we kind of get into the sort of the meat of today's topic, we're going to go through our Gloombusters, our good news stories for the week. So, Helen, do you want to kick us off? Any particular good news stories to share with us this week?
Well, I mean, I think this is going to just trump every other story, really. But my my nephew's Lego Advent calendar arrived in the post this week. So I'm trying not to open it, to be honest, because I want it for myself. But yeah, so that's arrived. He's going to be a happy chap on the 1st of December. And hopefully he's going to also like the other presents that I'm going to get him. So I've not peaked too soon. So yeah, that's my good news for this week.
Fantastic. Helen's nephew, if you're listening, we're really sorry we spoiled that for you.
Yes. He won't be listening, probably.
You listener, maybe for the future. So after that bombshell, perhaps we move on to yourselves. Your good news story for the week. Any good news stories you'd like to share with us?
Well, I was really struggling with good news in the business and finance section, so we might, as we'll probably come on to. So I was reading the newspaper this week about that amazing lady, Joan Hockard, who was 112 and Britain's oldest resident. And her sort of secret for long life was, 1, don't bother dieting, and secondly, eat lashings of butter and cream. So I took from that, that we're worried about pretty much everything that's happening at the moment in this country, and maybe we shouldn't worry quite so much.
Perfect advice, I think, definitely.
And Zenith, I believe you've also got quite a positive good news story to share with us this week as well.
Yeah, so I mean, like Giles was saying, there's a lot of negativity around in like the news as well, especially what the times that we're living in. But I found like a great story that is put like more of a positive spin and kind of finding the silver lining in like a cloud, I guess. So I found that a story where it showed that a poll shows people are picking up healthy new habits as a result of being home in the pandemic. And what they did was they did a survey of 2,000 adults, and more than 1/3 revealed they picked up and embraced good habits. 7 in 10 said their newfound rituals have made them happy and secure. And around 64 and 65% are actually exercising more and having like
You know, it's interesting, we've had those kind of two conflicting dieting ideals then, butter and cream and better healthy living habits. But I think it's great to hear, you know, that's the whole point of our Gloom Busters, to hear some kind of good news stories shining through, as you said, some of the more challenging things that are taking place at the moment. And that obviously leads quite nicely into our topic for today's podcast. So we're very fortunate, as I say, to be joined by two different individuals kind of representing interests within business, banking and finance from quite different levels of experience, but equal sort of levels of interest. And I suppose, you know, as you've sort of mentioned earlier, Giles, it's perhaps a particularly challenging time for the sector. And so this is something that we're hoping to explore as part of this podcast. So Helen, over to you.
Yeah, okay, so we'll get things started then. So Giles, if I just come to you first, so if you can just give us a brief overview about how COVID-19 has impacted your work and life during this time since about March, really.
Well, actually, yeah, I mean, the banking industry, I think, along with a lot of the office-based jobs, has responded really well. And actually, even before then, we did an awful lot of stuff around, you know, disaster recovery and this sort of stuff. So actually, moving to the remote working has been pretty seamless. And I think that's not just my bank, that's pretty much the whole industry. And so actually, it hasn't impacted so much. Now, of course, if you're talking to a high street bank, they'll say that there has been a lot of impact. They have obviously been supporting the government in rolling out all their support packages for businesses. So I think they would probably give a little different answer. My bank, Bank of London and Middle East, we have continued pretty seamlessly. Without too much disruption, actually, to our business.
That's really positive to hear. It's nice. We've had just in a mixture of all of our guests, we've had quite a difference in. Some people have been really impacted. Some people have kind of sailed through this and adapted and pivoted really quickly. So it's good to get that mixture there. Okay, then. So if we just focus in a little bit more about your kind of career history, going back to the start, so leaving university and to date, just talk us through how you ended up where you are today in the position that you're in.
Well, I mean, I left Sheffield University in the early 90s, and at that stage, of course, it was such a lucky time because there were a whole range of jobs you could do, and I ended up with a sort of list like everyone did of jobs. I joined Lloyds Bank and spent 15 or 16 years with them, doing all sorts of things, and then probably the next 15 or 16 years, I've been doing various banking jobs that have taken me all around the world. In Brazil, I've lived and worked in the United Arab Emirates, Oman and Qatar, and taken me to today where I'm running an Islamic bank, which was never part of the plan, but equally interesting. So I think if there's any message for your listeners there, it's that if you're worried you don't have a big plan, like mapped out for your whole career, don't worry. I really don't think that is the most important thing. Go, start something you have a passion for. Yes, which I did in banking. And then it's amazing if you stay flexible, you stay adaptable, you take chances as they come up. That's how I've got here. I'd love to say it was a big part of a plan, but it wasn't. You take your opportunity when it comes, and that's a quick guide to my 30 years.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really key point to focus in on there. It's kind of making it a bit more explicit for students and graduates that moving through your career journey is not all seamless at times, and it's not all part of a kind of master plan that you might have thrashed out when you were 15, 16, 18. It kind of happens. You just have to be there for the opportunities when they arise. So Zenith, coming over to you then at this point. So if you can just talk us through how things have been for you since March 2020, talking about why you chose the degree pathway that you have in your presidency with the FABSoc Society.
Yeah, so firstly, I chose my degree. When I came to university, I didn't know what I wanted to do. So I knew I had a passion for business. However, it's such a huge industry and there's so many different sectors I could go into. So I decided to just pick a course that's pretty versatile and also fundamental in terms of a business who I work for and so forth. So when I actually started, as soon as I started my course, I started getting a passion for more of the numbers side of it, working with the financial industries. And from reading more, it's just developed my passion through going into finance. So being as president, so I got elected in March 2020, which was probably the worst time to be elected as president. I had a manifesto and everything, and what I was going to implement seemed much harder than what I initially thought. But I mean, it's been really interesting. We've been put in a place where we had to think really creatively on how to do certain things, such as like increase engagement when everything's virtual. I'm speaking on behalf of all students as well, in terms of it's been really uncertain, really difficult. And for all uni students, especially freshers coming up to this September, who's going into university where there's no social ways of like meeting other students and so forth.
You know, as you said, obviously a really challenging time to kind of take on a role of that sort of responsibility, but it sounds as though you're kind of adapting and finding new ways to do that, which is brilliant. And I guess sort of leads us on quite nicely to our first sort of conversation piece, I suppose. And Giles, you've sort of mentioned a little bit, I guess, in your introduction about how your own kind of bank have sort of adapted to what's happened around COVID-19. I suppose a kind of question our listeners would be quite keen to hear the answer to is how maybe you feel the banking finance sector in general is kind of responding, or indeed has responded to COVID-19. And I know last time we spoke, we talked a little bit about how at times of economic crisis, there's often this kind of bashing of the bankers that goes on, in terms of previous financial crises, and whether there's any kind of, I suppose, myth busting you want to do there in terms of addressing some of those stereotypes as part of that answer as well.
Yeah, let me give it a go busting that myth. Back in 2008-9, of course, the banks were actually the cause of the problem. Let's be really clear about that. They were the cause. I think this time around, actually, the banks are one of the responders, if you like, to this crisis. You've seen the way they've mobilized their branch networks, their online presence to get all the government support distributed and prop up, businesses that are really struggling in this, unprecedented time. So actually, I think the banks have done quite a good job. History will say, let's just get through the whole pandemic and look back. But I think it's chalk and cheese with 2008 and 9. And on bank bashing, I always find this a bit difficult because really there were, maybe a dozen bankers at the top of some banks who probably didn't make very good decisions. But I'd remind people that there's about 1.1 million people in this country who work in banking and financial services. And the vast majority of those are customer service agents, telephone operators, and they really don't deserve to be dragged into that. And the vast majority of banking is highly ethical. We run a zero tolerance for any sort of lack of integrity in any part of banking that I've seen. So I think it's upped its game. The regulator has done a great job pulling people to account. So I would say, come on, give the bankers a little bit of a break this time. I think they've actually done a pretty good job so far.
You've heard it here first. There we go. The first shots fired in the anti-bank bashing campaign. But I think some really good points there. I think particularly around those common misconceptions around where people work within the industry. Just I suppose to come back sort of very briefly to the sector itself. You mentioned a little bit earlier about how your bankers, I guess, adapted in some ways to COVID. And as you said, some things were maybe easier than others. We're going to look a little bit later on, I guess, about what the next normal in banking could look like. But for the time being, how do you feel that the sector has been responding over the past sort of 6-7 months? And have there been any kind of seismic changes, I guess, that people should be aware of?
Well, I think what we might come on to is the banks have been investing heavily in online and digital presence. And you've seen, obviously, a lot of fintech startups actually capture some really good bits of the market, the banks like Starling, Monzo, Webb. So there was already something happening in banking, which was, a big push towards digitization. I think what you will see now as a result of the crisis is that accelerate even further. I think every bank, not just high street banks, all banking or financial services is realizing you have to step up, invest, and meet this new customer expectation, or you will not succeed. So I think that's going to be one of the big outcomes of the crisis. And I'm already seeing in the conversations I'm having with other bankers, other CEOs of even small, mid-sized banks, confirm to me that there isn't a bank that doesn't have now a heavy digitization program underway. So I think this is a very interesting move. And, you know, this is one of the positives. If we can draw any positives coming out of this crisis, for banking, this will be one of them. That there is no return to the old ways of working, either remote working, going back to the office. Nothing will change, stay the same. And likewise with people's digital presence, it will only now accelerate.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. It's very similar to what we've heard from a number of other professionals from sectors that we've interviewed as well. So I think, you know, we're seeing a little bit of a pattern there within certain industries. Zenith, I believe you wanted to kind of come in just with a little bit of a follow-up to this question as well.
Yeah, so from speaking with like digitisation and everything, and that's obviously going to be the foreseeable future of banking. Speaking from like a graduate perspective, what would you say the skills for graduates or whoever's entering the industry in an early career, what skills would be like the skills of tomorrow, would you suggest?
Well, the good thing about, the interesting thing about finance and banking is that it caters for a range of skills. So you might be more IT orientated, you might like more analytical stuff, you might like people, you know, the people side of a job. And banking and finance caters for all of that. So in that regard, it's really there for everybody. I think some of the, skill sets that I now see, Zenith, compared to when I joined, is really all the whole sort of data analytics, the data management, cyber modeling, compliance, and of course, what's coming hot down the line now is artificial intelligence. So for those graduates today who have any interest in these types of areas, they are very well rewarded in banking and financial services, because we're managing huge amounts of data, very sensitive data about customers, and we need to protect that. And so I think all those jobs, which I never even heard of 30 years ago, Zenith, to be honest with you, I think now the graduates of today, this is really your field. And, I would just say that, there's a lot of retraining happening in banking because people don't have those skills. So I think people leaving university today, if they have some of those skills that just haven't naturally been out there, I think you've got a great opportunity to close the gap with people that are already in the industry.
Yeah, that's great. And what would you say to graduates who are entering the industry right now? Is it harder for them than it was before coronavirus, before the pandemic, or do you think it's like not the same with especially in the banking industry?
Look, I think the reality is it's going to be harder. Let's face that. Let's not try and sugarcoat that one. The world is really tough now. There's going to be efficiencies across many sectors, and banking and finance will not escape that. Let's be really clear. In fact, as we're speaking this morning, HSBC announced a whole restructuring program. So it's here and now. That doesn't mean it'll be any easier, but it just means people will need to be more creative, more resilient in terms of how they get into the sector. We've always thought about, the big banks as offering graduate training programs. I joined Lloyds, as I said earlier. So that was the traditional way. But I see that breaking down now. I'll remind you, because I'm managing one of them. There are 250 foreign banks here having a presence in the UK. And these can range between small sort of 10-person offices to many thousands. And I think we need to think about how we get into these banks. If I was a graduate now, I wouldn't just restrict myself to, I'm applying to Lloyds, Barclays, NatWest, etc. There are many banks, and if you can get roles in some of these smaller banks, you get much more responsibility earlier too. So I would encourage people not to be too down on the fact that there will be less opportunities, but just get more creative, more resilient, more passionate, and find your way into one of these organizations and then show them what you can do.
Absolutely. I think that's absolutely brilliant advice. And not just for banking and finance students. I think that resilience, that creativity is going to be needed from graduates across all sectors, definitely. Brilliant. Okay, then moving on. So next question, Giles. So you mentioned earlier that you moved to Qatar to work previously and then since moved back to the UK to continue your career. So can you just give us a bit of an insight as to what it was like working in the banking sector abroad and how has that experience impacted your career?
Well, I never set out, as I said, to work overseas. But the fact that I've now worked in 4 countries, of which all of them, their first language wasn't English, always presents a bit of a challenge. But the common denominator is actually it's banking and finance. And that means a customer has a need and you need to satisfy that need for a product. It's really quite simple. And that happens everywhere in the world. The good thing is that if you actually start your career in the UK, it's such a very good training ground, the UK. It has great courses you can do, very relevant training courses. And then you've got a really strict regulator, so you learn to do things the right way. And we have, I think, generally a very good culture within our banks. That is attractive to foreign banks. That doesn't happen everywhere. So they quite like it when someone who has some experience in the UK to go out and help them improve as a foreign bank. So I must say, I found it hugely rewarding. I mean, the cultural differences, if you love to embrace cultural difference, it's great working overseas. Brazil being very, very different to, say, the Middle East, where I spent a lot of time. But yeah, look, I loved it, but I fell into it. It wasn't a plan, an opportunity popped up and I grabbed it. And then I end up building a little bit of a reputation for going around overseas banks, helping them out. So it's just the way it goes. But no, it's definitely helped my career, because it just creates something a little bit different when my CV pops up alongside someone who's just been in the UK. So I would say, if you have the chance, do it. You can't go far wrong. If it doesn't work out, just come home.
Yeah, for students and graduates, I feel like the option to work abroad is being pretty locked off at the moment, due to everything. So what advice would you give to anyone who's actually wanting to work abroad?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Zenith, because you're right. Now, of course, everyone with the travel restrictions and everything, no one can really think about how they can build some experience, even work experience that would have been possible abroad, of course. A lot of programs do some overseas experiences kind of ruled out, unfortunately. Go back to these 250 foreign banks, owned banks. If graduates can find a way in to start somehow with these banks, they have owners overseas. They're part of bigger banking networks that span the globe. That has to be an interesting way in, I think, if people are really excited about potentially working overseas in banking and finance. That's one way. Otherwise, just bide your time. Learn, get into a workplace if you can. Start to work hard, absorb like a sponge everything that you're seeing, and wait for the right time. Because, of course, we'll get through this, and the opportunities will open up again to patient students.
That's brilliant. Thank you.
Okay, so now we come to our top of the pod section of the podcast, where we ask our guests to provide us their favourites, podcasts that they're listening to, and recommendations for our listeners. So, Zenith, I'll come to you first. What are your favourite podcasts that you're listening to at the moment?
Yes, so I think one of my favourite podcasts is the Financial Times and Banking Weekly podcast. So any student in Sheffield Hallam already has a subscription to the Financial Times, a free one. So if you're definitely going into the banking or finance industry, I think it's great to just keep up with all the news articles that's being published. But if you don't have time, which sometimes if I'm running late or to university or wherever I'm going, listening to one of these podcasts, it's 15 to 25 minutes and it's really informative. It's really interesting as well. And I think that's probably one of my favourite ones that I do listen to. Brilliant.
Okay. And Giles, how about yourself?
Okay, bearing in mind I am a bit old, can I come out with two oldies for you, Helen?
Go for it.
Okay, so these have been around for ages, but I really recommend them if you want to get into the business and finance kind of thinking. First one is Wake Up to Money on 5 Live. It is on at 5:30 in the morning, so thank goodness now we have podcasts, because that was a challenge waking up at that time in the old days to watch it. This is on during the week, it's on podcast an hour later. And it's just a general run through of business, finance, markets, and this sort of thing. So for students, if you want to get sort of into the lingo, work out what's going on now, it's a really good one. And then the other one is has been around for years as well. I'm almost embarrassed to say it, but it's just so good. I still listen to it. Is Moneybox, Radio 4, which is personal finance. Now, some of that can be, do I really want personal finance? But it's so interesting, and it's so, even if it's not where you want to work necessarily, it's so useful for just yourself and your financial well-being too, to hear people's solutions and suggestions. So those are my two that I would recommend.
I don't think they're old at all, Giles. I think they're absolutely brilliant. No, absolutely perfect. Okay, thank you so much. That's perfect for our listeners.
Yeah, brilliant. Some really, really interesting reflections there. So moving on to perhaps something slightly different, Giles. I mean, we've heard quite a lot about leadership during the COVID-19 crisis in general, both in terms of sort of national governments and in relation to sort of industry leaders as well. How did you find it leading a large organisation during lockdown? And were there any kind of key lessons you took away from this period in terms of, I suppose, leadership lessons?
Perhaps I might surprise people that are not going to come up with the classic answer that all our leadership has been tested differently. Not really at all. Leadership is leadership. It doesn't matter whether you're remote working, you're in the office, you're leading change, or you're just maintaining the status quo, whether you're leading a massive project. It is, in my mind, that hasn't changed in this crisis. People still look to me for that inspiration that you'd expect of any CEO. So you have to be authentic. They've got to believe that you believe in it, and you have got to communicate brilliantly. Okay, maybe we've had to be even better at communication using Zoom and things. And you have to take people with you, and that hasn't changed. To be honest with you, it wouldn't matter which bank, massive bank, the Horto Osarios of Lloyd's, he will have a similar challenge, and he'll be still leading in the same, I'm sure, way to get through this crisis. So I don't buy the whole answer that we've got to change our leadership style here. We've just got to remind ourselves of what is just classic, excellent leadership.
Yeah, excellent. I really like that, Giles, and I like the honesty that you've given there as well. That's brilliant. Okay, so you've kind of sprinkled over this topic before, but just to kind of add anything extra really about what the next normal is going to look like for the banking sector in the UK and globally. So you spoke about that it's going to be a lot more digitised. Have you got anything else to add, or any other new additions that you think this new world is going to bring us?
Well, let me throw you one stat that I read in the last week, which was really interesting. FinTech's obviously disrupting the industry at the moment, particularly in terms of consumer finance. And in a recent survey, 73% of people said they're more excited about opening an account with a new bank than an old bank. Now, and that came from across the range, not just asking people from university. Now, if that plays out over the coming years, there is going to be a fundamental revolution in certainly retail banking, and I think that will expand to all sorts of banking. So digitization, the ability to onboard customers and open an account within seconds, is going to become the absolute norm. Customers' expectations will just rise and rise and rise, and they'll expect everything at their fingertips. I think the challenge for banks is not really like it used to be maybe 10 years ago when they came unstuck for not having the right products, not the best products for customers. You've all heard about the loan repayment insurance problem for the last decade of missold products. You've had the pension crisis. Look, I think the biggest challenge the banks have now to meet this whole digitization theme is really going to be the operational risk. A customer now is much less likely to have the wrong product. That's been very well regulated. But what if you're turning up at Morrison's and you want to pay for your shopping and your card doesn't work? I think this is where, the banks will lose their reputation and not be able to meet the customer need. It's no good saying we are great 97% of the time, because it will be the 3% of the time when you're stuck in that Morrison's queue that they say your card's been rejected. So this is what we call in banking operational resilience. You have to be on your game, working 100% pretty much all the time. And that's where the huge risks to banks are now. How do you meet this digital world and stay very resilient? Because it does bring in lots of risk for the bank. Just gives you a bit of a flavour of what the banks are kind of thinking about and how they meet this challenge.
Yeah, a lot of food for thought there, certainly. I mean, we're going to be putting some of the kind of links to sort of perhaps articles that you've mentioned, Giles, but also some additional articles around things like fintech, which, as you mentioned, having a huge impact on the sector as a whole. So lots of kind of great stuff to kind of take away there, lots of stuff to perhaps have a look at. If you're listening to the podcast and want to check that out, we'll have all of this in the episode notes if you want to have a look through anything in more detail. But I suppose as a little bit of a final thought, Zenith, I believe you're going to round things off for the podcast with us with perhaps a final question for Giles.
Yeah, so you mentioned earlier how the skills that are required for like a CEO in terms of like communication and so forth. But what would you give to students, or advice do you give to students or graduates on the skills they need to be a CEO? And what is the most difficult part of being a CEO?
Wow, lots of questions in one there. Let me try. Look, the most important thing is actually just getting your foot in the door. My recommendation is don't be too precious about what exactly it is. It might not be in the sweet spot that you hoped for if you enter the workplace in a bank or finance company. But I've seen so many examples. Just in the 4 years that I've been leading Bank of London and Middle East, we've had people coming in and within 6 months, they ask if they can just switch into another area and have just been terrific. You know, I've got the fabulous example of an apprentice who joined us a year and a half ago. Graduate, had an interest in IT, but no more than that. He joined the cyber side of our IT team, and he, in 18 months, has become the absolute go-to person for cyber risk, helping us protect our data and our customers. That just shows that it's possible. You know, you don't feel you need to be in that final job. Just get in and show them what you can do. Your passion, your desire, your thirst for learning will come through. So, you know, that doesn't really help the skills answer, but it's about an approach and saying it's not the end game. Just get in the door and show what you can do. We've had receptionists who are now managing a small operations team, and just within 2 years of joining us. So I don't think we're alone in saying, look, just be flexible and be open to all opportunities. Look, your last one was what's the lesson to be a CEO? Do you know, I don't know, but all I do know is all I've done is just be the best I can be normal, learn from everyone, make sure you find a mentor, because if you can get into the workplace and learn from people who have been around for years, they will mentor you, they will open doors for you. We used to have a big push on when I was a young in the workforce, just after I left university, was all about building your network. You know, a lot has changed in banking, but that hasn't. You need a network. So be very active on your network. Take time to engage with people, to have a coffee with them, to talk to them, to absorb their knowledge, and build a network of supporters, because I know in 30 years of this, it comes back home and it always helps in the end. So that would be my big tip, to make sure everyone does that. It's an old one, but it hasn't gone away.
That's amazing. Thank you.
That's brilliant. Thanks very much, Giles. And I know actually, Zenith, in fact, you know, in your kind of capacity as president of FABSoc, I know that, you know, a lot of what you do is built around kind of networking, providing those networking opportunities for fellow students. So I think it's great to hear that reflected from an experienced professional as well. And as you say, Giles, you know, certain things never go out of fashion, you know, from a professional capacity. So that's great to hear. So we really hope you've enjoyed listening to today's episode. I think there's been fantastic insights crammed in, you know, to the podcast today. And again, if you've heard discussed, you want to perhaps kind of follow up on it, find out a little bit more, we'll be putting relevant links into the episode notes. So do check those out if you're listening to the podcast at home. But all that remains to be said is thank you very much to Giles for joining us.
Thank you, Giles.
Thank you, Helen, and thanks, Zenith, for your great questions.
Thank you very much to Zenith for joining us. Thank you to those listening at home. And again, if you have any questions, do get in touch with Helen or I via LinkedIn. Thanks very much for listening and have a good day. If you're interested in anything that's been discussed on the podcast, or would like to be involved as a guest or have a topic to share, please get in touch with Helen or I via LinkedIn. Full details can be found in the episode notes on the Simplecast site.